There are places along the Pacific coast where the land meets the sea with such violence that even the bravest men speak in whispers. The collision is not gentle. It is not gradual. It is a war that has been waging since before men gave names to things, since before the first human eyes looked out over those gray waters and felt the primal fear that comes from standing at the edge of everything known. Oregon in 1893 was a frontier of a different kind, not the dusty plains of the interior where the sun beat down and the earth stretched flat to the horizon, not the gold-fevered mountains of California where men tore at the ground in their desperation to extract wealth from stone. This was a wet, cold, relentless edge of America, where the ocean crashed against black rocks with the fury of something that had been trying to break through for millennia. The rocks themselves seemed to resist, ancient basalt formations that had stood since the world was young, now worn smooth by the endless assault of waves that came in sets, in rhythms older than human heartbeat, older than the turning of seasons. The coastal forests grew dense and dark right up to the cliff edges, hemlock and spruce that leaned away from the sea as if in fear, their branches twisted by the constant wind that blew in from the west, from the vast expanse of the Pacific that stretched unbroken for thousands of miles until it met the shores of distant lands that most men in Oregon would never see. The coast was sparsely populated in those days. Small fishing villages clung to protected coves. Logging camps marked the river mouths where timber could be floated down from the interior forests. But between these outposts of human habitation were long stretches of wild shoreline where no one lived, where no one could live, where the elements conspired to make survival an exercise in constant vigilance and iron will. The lighthouse keepers who tended the beacons along that savage coastline were a particular breed of men, solitary by nature or by necessity, disciplined in ways that went beyond simple routine. Their discipline was a form of survival, a way of maintaining sanity in the face of crushing isolation, comfortable with silence and the company of their own thoughts in a manner that most men could never understand. They had to be. The work demanded it. The isolation required it. Some stations were so remote that supplies came only once every 3 months, and in winter, when the storms came rolling in from the Pacific with winds that could tear a man from his feet, even those quarterly visits were uncertain. Some lighthouses were built on rocks so isolated that the only way to reach them was by rope and pulley. During the brief windows when the sea allowed such audacity, when the waves calmed enough that a small boat could approach without being dashed to pieces against the rocks, the keepers would be lowered in cages along with their supplies, swinging over the churning water while gulls screamed overhead and the spray soaked them to the bone. They would live for months at a time without seeing another human face, without hearing another human voice save for their fellow keepers. They would mark the days by the turning of the light, by the rising and setting of the sun, by the changing of the tides. They would develop routines so rigid that they became almost ritual. Wake at the same hour, eat the same breakfast, perform the same maintenance tasks in the same order, wind the clockwork mechanism that turned the lens, polish the brass fittings until they gleamed, trim the wicks, clean the glass, record the weather, watch for ships, sleep in shifts, and always keep the light burning. That was the sacred duty. The light must never fail, not in fog, not in storm, not for any reason. Because out there in the darkness, men in wooden ships were depending on that beam to guide them past the rocks, to show them the way to safe harbor, to keep them from the hungry mouth of the sea that was always waiting, always ready to swallow them whole. The keepers understood this. They took pride in it. It gave their isolation meaning. It made the loneliness bearable. They were not hermits fleeing the world. They were guardians standing watch over it. The Cape Mercy Lighthouse stood on a promontory 12 miles north of a settlement that barely qualified as a town, a collection of wooden buildings huddled around a natural harbor, a general store, a church, a scattering of houses occupied by fishermen and their families. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, where strangers were remarked upon, where life moved to the rhythm of the tides and the seasons. From the town, you could see the lighthouse on clear days, a white tower rising from the dark rocks, like a finger pointing at heaven, or perhaps like a warning. It was a tall structure, 108 feet from base to lantern room, painted white, though the salt and wind had turned it the color of old bone within a year of its construction. The paint would peel and crack and have to be reapplied, but within months it would begin the same transformation, bleached and weathered by the relentless assault of the elements. The tower tapered slightly as it rose, graceful in its proportions despite its utilitarian purpose. At its base was the keeper's house, a squat stone building with small windows and thick walls designed to withstand the worst that the Pacific could throw at it. The roof was slate, heavy and dark, held down by iron clamps because wooden shingles would have been torn away in the first winter storm. Inside, the rooms were Spartan, whitewashed walls, plank floors, simple furniture built by the keepers themselves during the long hours when there was nothing else to do. A cast iron stove that consumed wood and coal in equal measure, its pipe rising through the roof, its warmth never quite reaching the corners of the rooms where the cold seemed to pool and settle like standing water. The light itself was a first-order Fresnel lens, imported from France at considerable expense, a marvel of optical engineering. It stood as tall as a man and weighed several thousand pounds. Its concentric rings of glass prisms were designed to capture every ray of light from the lamp at its center and project them outward in a focused beam capable of being seen from 23 miles at sea. On clear nights, sailors reported seeing it from even farther, a solitary eye watching over waters that had claimed more ships than any man could count. The lens floated on a bath of mercury, allowing it to rotate smoothly despite its massive weight, turned by a clockwork mechanism that had to be wound every 4 hours. The sound of that mechanism was constant in the lighthouse, a steady tick-tock that marked time with mechanical precision that became so familiar to the keepers that they stopped hearing it consciously, though it was always there in the background of their thoughts, a heartbeat, a metronome, a reminder that time was passing and the light was turning, and the watch continued whether they willed it or not. The lighthouse had been operational since 1878. In 15 years, it had saved countless vessels from the rocks that lurked just beneath the surface like the teeth of some great submerged beast. The men who kept that light burning were heroes in the quiet way that such men are. They did their duty. They asked for nothing. They disappeared into their work and emerged only when their rotation ended and another keeper came to relieve them. In October of 1893, 3 men were stationed at Cape Mercy. The head keeper was a man named Samuel Crane. He was 46 years old, a veteran of the lighthouse service with 19 years of experience. He had worked stations from Maine to Washington, and those who knew him said he was as reliable as the tide. He kept meticulous logs. He maintained the equipment with religious devotion. He did not drink. He did not complain. He simply did the work. His assistant keepers were younger men. The first was Joseph Ridley, 31, who had been with the service for 8 years. The second was a man named Thomas Webb, 27, newer to the work, but eager and capable. The three of them had been together at Cape Mercy since August. They worked in shifts, ensuring the light was never unattended, ensuring the lamp was trimmed and the lens cleaned, ensuring the machinery that rotated the great lamp continued its patient revolution through every hour of darkness. The last supply boat reached Cape Mercy on October 8th. The captain was a man named Horace Leland, who had been making the run to the lighthouse for 6 years. He found the keepers in good spirits and good health. They unloaded flour, salt pork, kerosene, lamp oil, tobacco, and a sack of letters that had accumulated at the mainland post office. Crane signed the manifest. They spoke briefly about the weather, which had been unusually clear. Leland asked if they needed anything beyond what was on the list. Crane said they did not. The whole exchange took less than an hour. By noon, Leland was rowing back to his boat, and the keepers were hauling the supplies up the narrow path to the lighthouse. Leland would later testify that he saw nothing unusual. The light was burning properly. The men seemed ordinary. There was no sign of distress, no indication of anything wrong. The next supply run was scheduled for January 9th, 3 months away. But on the evening of November 14th, a fishing vessel passing within sight of the Cape reported something strange. The lighthouse beam was visible, rotating as it should, but something about it seemed wrong. The fisherman, a Portuguese immigrant named Manuel Costa, told the harbor master in the nearest town that the light seemed brighter than usual, impossibly bright. He said it hurt to look at directly, that it left spots in his vision even after he turned away. The harbor master made a note but took no action. Lighthouse lenses were powerful instruments. Perhaps the air was unusually clear. Perhaps Costa had been staring at it too long. 3 days later, another report came in, this time from the captain of a lumber schooner heading south from Astoria. He said the same thing. The light at Cape Mercy was burning with unnatural intensity. Moreover, he claimed that it never wavered, never dimmed, never showed the slightest fluctuation. A well-maintained light should burn steadily, yes, but there are always minor variations as the lamp consumes its fuel, as the wick burns down, as the keeper trims and adjusts. This light, the captain insisted, was absolutely constant, like a star, like something that was not being tended by human hands at all, but by some other force entirely. By the end of November, the reports had become frequent enough that the lighthouse service took notice. On December 1st, they dispatched a cutter to Cape Mercy with instructions to check on the keepers and assess the situation. The cutter was a small steam-powered vessel, sturdy enough for coastal work, but not built for comfort. It took 8 hours to reach the promontory. The sea was rough that day, the wind cold and wet. The men aboard could see the lighthouse from miles away. The light was indeed burning, visible even in the gray afternoon. As they drew closer, they noticed something else. There was no smoke coming from the keeper's dwelling, no lights in the windows, no movement on the grounds. The cutter anchored in the lee of the rocks and sent a boat ashore with 4 men. The climb up to the lighthouse was steep and treacherous, the path slick with rain and seaweed. The men called out as they climbed but received no answer. When they reached the top, they found the door to the keeper's house standing open. The first man to enter was a lighthouse inspector named William Marsh. He would later write in his official report that the silence inside was total and oppressive. He called out again. No response. The house was a simple structure attached to the base of the lighthouse tower. It contained a kitchen, a common room, and 3 small sleeping quarters. Marsh and his men searched every room. They found the bunks neatly made, the kitchen clean, the stove cold. The logbook lay open on the table in the common room. The last entry was dated October 12th, 4 days after the supply boat had departed. It was written in Samuel Crane's precise hand. It noted the weather, the condition of the light, and a minor repair made to one of the pulleys used to haul supplies. There was nothing unusual in the entry, nothing to suggest distress or danger. But the keepers were gone. All 3 of them vanished. Their coats still hung on the pegs by the door. Their boots stood in a neat row beneath. Their personal effects were undisturbed. Money lay on the table. Letters lay half-written. A pipe sat in an ashtray. The tobacco in the bowl burned down to ash. Everything suggested that the men had simply stood up in the middle of their routines and walked away. Except there was nowhere to walk. The lighthouse stood on a narrow spit of rock surrounded on 3 sides by cliffs that dropped 80 feet to the churning sea below. The only path down was the one the inspection team had just climbed. There were no boats, no rafts, no means of departure. Marsh ordered his men to search the grounds thoroughly. They found nothing, no bodies, no signs of struggle, no footprints leading away from the compound. The only thing that seemed out of place was the light itself. Marsh climbed the spiral staircase to the lantern room at the top of the tower. The stairs were narrow and steep, worn smooth by 15 years of keepers climbing up and down in an endless cycle of duty. 114 steps rising through the hollow core of the structure, winding around and around until vertigo threatened to overwhelm balance. The walls were white brick, close and confining, lit only by the small windows set at irregular intervals. The climb left him breathless and dizzy. His legs burned, his heart hammered in his chest. When he reached the top and pushed open the heavy iron door and stepped into the lantern room, he stopped. The space was circular, perhaps 12 feet in diameter, surrounded by windows that looked out in all directions over the sea and the rocks and the wild coast beyond. The Fresnel lens dominated the space, a massive construction of glass prisms and brass fittings that seemed almost alive in the way it caught and refracted the light from the lamp at its center. The lamp itself was a complex mechanism, a multi-wick burner that fed on kerosene from a reservoir mounted below. In normal operation, it would burn with a steady but ordinary flame, yellow-white, visible but not painful to look at. The lens would magnify and focus that flame, projecting it outward as the rotating mechanism carried it around and around, creating the characteristic flash pattern that identified each lighthouse to sailors who knew how to read the code. But what Marsh saw when he stepped into that room was not normal. At its center, the lamp burned with a brilliance that made him shield his eyes immediately, throwing up his arm as if to ward off a physical blow. The light was wrong. It was too white, too pure, like looking into the heart of a lightning bolt or the surface of the sun. It did not flicker. It did not waver. It did not show any of the minor variations that characterized a flame-consuming fuel and oxygen in the chaotic dance of combustion. It simply burned with an intensity that seemed to come from somewhere other than the kerosene reservoir that fed it. Marsh felt the heat radiating from the lamp, even from several feet away. It was immense, tropical, a physical presence that made the air shimmer and dance. Sweat sprang out on his forehead and ran down his face. His eyes watered. He could feel his skin tightening, as if he had stepped too close to a forge. This was not possible. No kerosene lamp could burn like this. The heat alone should have cracked the glass chimney, should have melted the brass fittings, should have set the oil in the reservoir boiling and exploding, yet everything was intact. The lamp housing showed no signs of stress. The lens showed no signs of heat damage. The brass was cool to the touch when he dared to reach out and brush his fingers against the frame. Only the light itself was wrong, impossibly bright, impossibly hot, impossibly constant. Marsh approached cautiously. The heat radiating from the lamp was immense. He could feel it on his face and hands, even from several feet away. The reservoir should have been nearly empty after 7 weeks of continuous burning. Instead, it was full. The gauge showed maximum capacity. Marsh checked the supply room adjacent to the lantern room. The kerosene cans were unopened, stacked exactly as they should be. No one had refilled the reservoir, yet it was full, and the light continued to burn. He descended and gathered his men. They conducted a second search, more thorough than the first. They found the lighthouse log in a drawer in the keeper's office. Crane had kept it faithfully, as regulations required. Marsh sat at the desk and read through the entries, going back weeks, then months. The entries were routine: weather observations, maintenance notes, the arrival and departure of vessels within sight. On September 23rd, Crane noted a pod of whales passing close to the rocks. On October 1st, he recorded a storm that lasted 3 days. On October 9th, he mentioned the supply boat's visit. Then the entries stopped, not abruptly, not mid-sentence, but simply ended with the October 12th entry, as if that had been the last day of the keepers' lives. But Marsh found something else in the log. In the margins of several pages beginning in late September, there were small notations in what appeared to be Crane's handwriting, but less controlled, almost scrawled. They were brief and cryptic. On September 28th, in the margin beside an otherwise ordinary weather entry, someone had written, "Heard it again." On October 2nd, third night, louder. On October 7th, Ridley refuses to speak of it. And on October 11th, the day before the final entry, cannot keep them from the rocks. Marsh showed these notations to his men. None of them knew what to make of it. They searched for another logbook, something unofficial, where the keepers might have recorded more personal observations. They found nothing. They searched the sleeping quarters again, looking through the men's belongings with growing unease. In Thomas Webb's footlocker, beneath a layer of work clothes, they found a small leather journal. It was not part of the official record. It appeared to be a personal diary. Marsh opened it and began to read. The early entries were mundane. Webb wrote about his adjustment to life at the lighthouse, about learning the routines, about the monotony and the strange beauty of the isolation. He described Samuel Crane as stern but fair, a man who expected much but taught patiently. He described Joseph Ridley as quiet and prone to melancholy but good-hearted. He wrote about the sounds of the sea, the cry of the gulls, the way the wind howled through gaps in the walls on stormy nights. But in mid-September, the tone of the entries began to change. On September 21st, Webb wrote, "There is a sound that comes at night. It begins around midnight and continues until just before dawn. Crane says it is only the wind striking the rocks at a particular angle, creating a resonance in the caves below that amplifies and distorts the natural sounds of the sea." He explained it to me with the patience of a school teacher, drawing diagrams on a piece of paper, showing how wind and water can create harmonics that mimic other sounds, even voices. His explanation made perfect sense, but it does not account for what I hear, because this does not sound like wind. It does not sound like water flowing through stone channels. It sounds like voices, many voices, overlapping and interweaving, speaking in a language I do not understand. There is structure to it, patterns, repetitions. Sometimes the voices rise together as if in excitement or celebration. Sometimes they fall to whispers as if sharing secrets. Sometimes they seem to be calling, their tone urgent, almost pleading. I lie in my bunk and listen and try to convince myself that Crane is right, that it is merely an acoustic phenomenon, a trick played by geology and meteorology. But my body knows better. My body tenses when I hear it. My heart beats faster. My breath comes shallow. The sound reaches into some primitive part of my brain, some ancient center that responds to predator calls and warnings of danger, and it tells me that what I am hearing is not natural. It is not wind. It is not water. It is something else, something that should not be. On September 25th, the sound came again last night. Ridley heard it too. We were both awake, both on duty. Crane was asleep. Ridley asked me if I thought it was men, if perhaps a ship had wrecked on the rocks and survivors were calling for help. But the sea was calm. There was a full moon. We could see for miles. There was no ship, no wreckage. The sound seemed to come from beneath us, from the rocks themselves. On September 29th, Crane heard it tonight. He went outside with a lantern, climbed down the path part way to where he could see the base of the cliffs. He was gone for nearly an hour. When he came back, he would not speak. He sat at the table with his hands folded and stared at the wall. Ridley asked him what he had seen. Crane said nothing. He simply sat there until his shift at the light. Then he climbed the stairs and did not come down until morning. On October 3rd, it is not voices. It is singing. I am certain now. It is a kind of singing, low and rhythmic, like a chant. It rises and falls with the waves. When the tide is high, it is louder. When the tide is low, it fades. But it never stops completely. Even during the day, if I listen carefully, I can hear it beneath the wind and the gulls. Ridley has stopped sleeping. He sits in the common room with his eyes open, listening. Crane goes through the motions of his duties, but says nothing. I have tried to speak to both of them. They will not answer. On October 6th, last night I saw something. I was on watch in the lantern room, tending the light, when I looked out over the water and saw shapes in the foam at the base of the rocks. They were pale and moved with a fluidity that was not human. I thought at first they were seals, but seals do not move like that. They do not rise out of the water and stand on the rocks and turn their faces toward the light. They do not raise their arms. They do not sing. On October 9th, the supply boat came today. I wanted to speak to Captain Leland. I wanted to ask him to take me back with him, but when the moment came, I could not do it. Crane was watching me. Ridley was watching me. I felt that if I said anything, if I revealed what we have been hearing and seeing, something terrible would happen. So I said nothing. I smiled. I helped unload the supplies. I watched the boat row away, and now we are alone again, and the singing continues. On October 10th, they are coming closer. Each night, they are closer. Last night, I saw them on the lower rocks. Tonight, I saw them halfway up the path. They do not walk, they glide. Their skin is white, like the belly of a fish. Their hair is long and dark and moves as if underwater, even though the air is still. They do not have eyes. Where their eyes should be, there are only smooth expanses of skin. But they see. I know they see. They turn their heads toward the light. They reach toward it, and they sing. God help me, they sing. On October 11th, Ridley is gone. He walked out this morning while Crane and I were sleeping. He did not take his coat. He did not take anything. I woke to find the door open and Ridley's bunk empty. I went outside and called for him. There was no answer. I climbed down the path as far as I dared. I saw his body on the rocks below. The tide was coming in. The waves were pulling at him. And around him, I saw them. Dozens of them. They were touching him, lifting him, carrying him down into the water. I ran back up the path. I told Crane. He nodded slowly and said he heard the call. He could not resist. I asked him what he meant. He did not answer. He went to the lantern room and began his shift. I do not know what to do. I do not know if we will survive until the next supply boat. That was the last entry in Webb's journal. October 11th, the same day of the cryptic notation in the official log. Marsh finished reading and sat in silence. His men stood around him, their faces pale. One of them asked if they should search for bodies in the water. Marsh shook his head. The sea was too rough. If the men had gone into the water, they were long gone. Besides, Ridley's death was described in the journal. The question was, what had happened to Crane and Webb after that final entry? They searched the lighthouse one more time. They searched every corner, every closet, every storage space. They found nothing. As the afternoon wore on and the light began to fade, Marsh made a decision. They would spend the night. They would keep watch. They would see if anything unusual occurred. His men were reluctant, but they obeyed. They brought supplies up from the boat and prepared to wait. As darkness fell, Marsh climbed to the lantern room to inspect the light again. It burned as brightly as before. The reservoir was still full. He could find no rational explanation for it. He checked the mechanism that rotated the lens. It was functioning perfectly, as if it had been serviced that very day. He descended and joined his men in the common room. The first hour passed without incident. They sat around the table drinking coffee, speaking in low voices. The wind picked up as night deepened, and the sound of it through the rocks and around the tower was eerie, but not unnatural. Marsh tried to convince himself that everything had a rational explanation. The keepers had gone mad from isolation. They had walked into the sea. The light continued to burn because someone, perhaps Crane in his final lucid moments, had overfilled the reservoir. These things happened. The mind played tricks in lonely places. But as the second hour passed, they began to hear it. At first, it was so faint that Marsh thought he was imagining it. A low sound, rhythmic and distant, like wind through a cave, but not quite. There was a structure to it, a pattern. The men fell silent, listening. The sound grew louder. It rose and fell like a tide. It seemed to come from below, from the rocks themselves. One of the men, a young sailor named Peters, stood abruptly and said, "That's singing." Marsh told him to sit down. Peters sat, but his hands were shaking. The singing continued for an hour, then 2, then 3. It never stopped. It never faltered. It never changed key or tempo. It was absolutely constant, as if it were not being produced by living throats, but by something else, something mechanical or geological or utterly alien. Marsh tried to block it out, tried to focus on the wind howling around the tower, on the crash of waves against the rocks, on the creaking of the building settling under the force of the gale that had risen with the darkness. But the singing was insistent. It wormed its way into his mind like a parasite burrowing into flesh. It bypassed his conscious defenses and planted itself directly in his thoughts. He found himself listening for patterns, for words, for meaning. There was a language there, he was certain, structure, grammar, syntax, but it was not a language he recognized. It was not English or Spanish or French or any native tongue he had encountered in his travels along the coast. It was older than language. It was something that existed before men had words, before they had developed the capacity for symbolic thought, before they had crawled out of whatever dark place they had originated. It was a sound that reached down into the most primitive part of his brain, into the stem where instinct lived, and it whispered terrible promises. Promises of peace, of belonging, of purpose, of release from the burden of consciousness. It told him that if he simply walked outside, if he went down to the rocks, if he entered the water, all his struggles would end, all his doubts would be silenced. He would become part of something greater than himself, something eternal, something beautiful. He shook his head violently, trying to dislodge the thoughts. They were not his thoughts. They were being planted, suggested, implanted. He looked at his men. They were all staring at nothing, their eyes glazed, their bodies tense. They were listening. They were all listening, and they were all thinking the same thing. He could see it in their faces. The pull, the urge, the desire to go outside, to answer the call, to give themselves to whatever was making that sound. Around midnight, Peter stood again. This time, he did not sit. He walked to the door. Marsh called his name. Peters did not respond. He opened the door and stepped out into the night. Marsh and the other men followed. They found Peter standing on the path, staring down toward the rocks. The singing was louder out here, clearer. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere. Marsh grabbed Peters by the shoulder and shook him. Peters turned slowly. His eyes were wide and empty. He said, "They're calling. Can't you hear them calling?" Marsh slapped him. Peters blinked and seemed to come back to himself. He looked around in confusion and began to cry. They dragged him back inside and barred the door. The singing continued until just before dawn. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. It was absolute and suffocating. Marsh and his men sat in the common room, exhausted and terrified, waiting for the light. When the sun finally rose, they fled. They did not take time to secure the lighthouse. They did not make a thorough report. They simply climbed down the path, got in the boat, and rowed back to the cutter as fast as they could. Once aboard, they weighed anchor and left Cape Mercy behind. Marsh would later submit a written report, but he would never speak of that night again. Peters was discharged from service 3 weeks later. After a breakdown, the other men requested transfers to inland postings. The lighthouse service did not know what to do. 3 men were missing, presumed dead, though their bodies had not been recovered. The light continued to burn with impossible constancy. There was no explanation that satisfied the rational mind. The service could not simply abandon the station. It was too important. Ships depended on it. The waters off Cape Mercy were treacherous, studded with submerged rocks, and subject to sudden fogs that could reduce visibility to nothing in minutes. Without the lighthouse, vessels would founder, men would die. The service had a responsibility, so they sent a new crew, a head keeper and 2 assistants. These men were told nothing of what had happened to their predecessors. They were told only that the previous crew had been reassigned due to administrative reasons, that there had been some irregularities in the record-keeping. Nothing serious, nothing to concern themselves with. The new men arrived in late December on a gray afternoon when the sea was calm and the sky was low with clouds that threatened snow. They climbed the path carrying their personal belongings, their supplies for the months ahead. They entered the keeper's house and found it clean and well ordered. The stove was stocked with wood. The pantry was full. The bunks were made with fresh linen. Everything suggested a normal rotation. The outgoing keepers must have been thorough in their preparations before departing. The new head keeper, a man named Robert Finch, inspected the premises and found everything satisfactory. He climbed to the lantern room and examined the light. It was burning as it should, bright and steady. The lens was clean. The machinery was in good working order. He made a notation in the log, recording the change of watch, the names of the new crew, the date and time of their arrival. That was December 23rd. On January 2nd, a supply boat made an unscheduled run to Cape Mercy because the captain, the same Horace Leland, who had been the last to see the original crew alive, had a bad feeling. He could not explain it. He simply felt that something was wrong. When he reached the lighthouse, he found the door standing open again. The house was empty. Finch and his 2 assistants were gone, vanished. Their coats hung on the pegs. Their boots stood in a row. The stove was cold, but had been used recently. The log showed entries up to December 30th, then nothing. The light was burning. The reservoir was full. Leland did not enter the lantern room this time. He did not climb the stairs. He simply gathered what evidence he could, sealed the house as best he was able, and fled back to his boat. He reported the disappearance to the lighthouse service. They were incredulous. This could not be happening again. It was impossible. There had to be an explanation. Desertion, accident, foul play, something rational, something that fit within the framework of how the world was supposed to work. But the evidence suggested otherwise. And when they sent a 3rd crew in mid-January, men who were promised double pay and who knew the risks, who had been briefed on the previous disappearances and told to be vigilant, those men lasted 6 days. 6 days before they too vanished, leaving behind only the burning light and the empty house, and a growing sense that Cape Mercy was not a place where men could survive. The service sent another crew. They lasted 6 days, then another. They lasted 3. By the end of January, word had spread through the lighthouse service. Cape Mercy was cursed. Men refused the assignment. They would rather be fired than go there. The service tried offering double pay, triple pay. It did not matter. No one would go. So they made a decision. They would close the station. They would extinguish the light. Let the ships find another way. Let the coast claim what it would. Better that than send more men to their doom. A team was dispatched in early February with orders to deactivate the light and secure the facility. They arrived on a gray morning, the sea calm for once, the wind low. They climbed the path with a sense of dread, but also determination. This would end today. They entered the keeper's house and found it as the previous crews had left it, empty, clean, silent. They climbed the stairs to the lantern room. The light was burning as always. One of the men, a senior inspector named Gerald Hatch, approached the reservoir and opened the valve to drain the fuel. The kerosene began to flow. He watched it pour out until the reservoir was empty. The flame flickered but did not die. He closed the valve and stared at the lamp. It continued to burn. He drained the reservoir again. Still the flame burned. He removed the fuel line entirely. The flame burned. He dismantled the lamp mechanism. The flame burned. Finally, in desperation, he took a heavy wrench and smashed the glass of the lamp itself. The shards fell to the floor. The flame hung in the air where the lamp had been. Unsupported, impossible. It burned. Hatch and his men fled. They reported what they had seen. The lighthouse service made the decision to abandon Cape Mercy entirely. They issued a notice to mariners warning that the light was not to be trusted. They posted guards at the base of the path to prevent anyone from climbing up, but the guards would not stay. After the first night, they refused to return. They spoke of the singing. They spoke of shapes moving in the darkness. So the service gave up. They left the lighthouse to whatever had claimed it, and the light continued to burn. For weeks, for months, sailors reported seeing it, steady and bright every night without fail. Some said it was brighter than ever, visible from 30 miles out. Some said it moved, that it was no longer fixed to the tower, but drifted above the rocks like a will-o'-the-wisp. Some said that ships that followed it too closely were never seen again, that the light lured them onto the rocks just as surely as if it had been extinguished. In March, a journalist from Portland traveled to the coast to investigate. He interviewed William Marsh, who had led the first inspection. Marsh was reluctant to speak, but eventually he agreed to tell his story. He gave the journalist the journal he had taken from the lighthouse, Webb's Journal. The journalist published an account of the disappearances in a regional newspaper. It caused a sensation. People spoke of curses and ghosts. Some said the lighthouse had been built on native ground, on a place that had been sacred long before white men arrived. Some said the rocks beneath the lighthouse were hollow, that there were caves that led down to places where the ocean met something else, something dark and old. Some said the keepers had been taken by the spirits of drowned sailors, by the ghosts of all those who had died on those rocks over the centuries. The theories multiplied, but no one knew the truth. In April, a storm struck the coast. It was one of the worst in living memory. The wind reached speeds of 70 miles per hour. The waves rose to heights of 40 feet. Ships that were caught in it were driven ashore or sunk. When the storm passed and the sun returned, observers along the coast looked toward Cape Mercy. The lighthouse was gone, not collapsed, not damaged, gone. The entire structure had vanished as if it had never existed. The rocks were bare. The promontory was empty. There was no rubble, no debris, just clean stone and the endless sea. A party was sent to investigate. They climbed the path, now overgrown after months of neglect. They reached the summit and found nothing, no foundation, no sign that a building had ever stood there. The only thing they found was a patch of ground at the center of the promontory where nothing grew. The stone there was smooth and black, as if it had been scorched by tremendous heat. And in the center of that blackened circle, there was a depression, not deep, perhaps 2 feet, but perfectly circular. And at the bottom of that depression, they found bones, human bones, 3 skulls, ribs, vertebrae, femurs. The bones were clean, stripped of all flesh, white as chalk. They were arranged in a pattern. The 3 skulls formed a triangle. The other bones radiated outward from them like the spokes of a wheel, or like rays of light from a flame. The party gathered the bones and brought them back to the mainland. A doctor examined them. He determined they were the remains of 3 adult males. Cause of death could not be determined. The bones showed no signs of trauma, no fractures, no marks. They were simply empty, clean, as if the men had been burned away from the inside. The bones were identified through dental records and personal effects that had been cataloged when the men first went missing. They belonged to Samuel Crane, Joseph Ridley, and Thomas Webb. The first crew, the 3 men who had been stationed at Cape Mercy when the lighthouse had begun its impossible burning. They were buried in a cemetery in the nearest town. Their graves were marked with simple stones. The lighthouse service officially closed the case. The disappearances were attributed to drowning, though everyone knew that was a lie. The bones told a different story, but it was a story no one wanted to hear. Years passed. The memory of Cape Mercy faded. The lighthouse was removed from charts. The promontory became just another nameless point along a coast that had thousands of such points. But the fishermen who worked those waters remembered. They avoided that stretch of shoreline. They would not anchor near those rocks, and on certain nights, when the moon was dark and the tide was high, some of them claimed they could still see a light burning on the empty promontory, a pale light, steady and bright, casting its beam out over the water, and beneath it, they said, you could hear singing, low and rhythmic, like a chant, like a call, like something that was waiting for the next keeper to climb the path and tend a flame that should not exist. In 1910, a man named Arthur Brennan published a book about maritime mysteries along the Pacific coast. He included a chapter on Cape Mercy. He had conducted extensive research, interviewing surviving witnesses, reading the official reports, examining the journals that had been preserved. He concluded that the lighthouse had been built atop a site of great spiritual significance, though to whom or what he could not say. He noted that the native tribes who had lived in the region for thousands of years before white settlement had no name for the promontory. When pressed, they would only say that it was a place where the boundary was thin, where what lived in the deep could reach into the world of light, where bargains could be made. Brennan found a record of the lighthouse construction in 1878. It had been a difficult project. The workers had complained of strange sounds and visions. 3 men had died during the construction, falling from scaffolding under unclear circumstances. The engineer overseeing the project had written in his private log that the men had seemed to leap rather than fall, that they had done so while singing. The log had been dismissed as the ravings of a man under stress, but Brennan believed there was truth in it. He believed the lighthouse had disturbed something, that by building a beacon of light in that place, men had issued a challenge, and something had answered. He interviewed an old man who had been a laborer on the construction crew. The man was in his 70s by then, his memory fading, but he remembered. He said that on the night they had first lit the lamp, they had heard singing from the rocks below. The foreman had told them it was just the wind, but they knew better. They had felt something shift. The old man said, "We brought light to a place that was meant to stay dark. We called to something that should have been left sleeping, and when it woke, it was hungry, hungry for the light, hungry for the keepers of the light, and it will keep taking them, anyone fool enough to tend that flame, until the end of days." Brennan's book did not sell well. It was dismissed as sensationalism, but those who read it remembered, and when they passed Cape Mercy on their ships or saw it from the shore, they would turn away. They would not look too long at the empty rocks. They would not listen too closely to the wind, because some lights are not meant to guide us home. Some lights are beacons for other things, things that live in the spaces between the waves, things that sing in voices older than man, things that wait, patient and eternal, for the next keeper to arrive, for the next flame to be lit, for the next offering to be made. The official records state that the Cape Mercy Lighthouse was decommissioned in February 1894 and destroyed by natural causes in April of the same year. But those records are incomplete. They do not mention the singing. They do not mention the shapes that climbed the rocks at night. They do not mention the light that continued to burn long after the keepers had vanished, long after the fuel had run dry, long after all rational explanation had been exhausted. The records do not mention these things because the men who wrote them did not want to believe. They wanted to assign the mystery to madness, to isolation, to the cruel coincidences of fate. But the truth is simpler and more terrible than that. There are places on this earth where the laws that govern our daylight world do not apply, where other laws, older laws, hold sway. Cape Mercy was such a place. The Lighthouse was an intrusion, a defiance, and defiance has a price. 3 men paid it first, then 3 more, then 3 more. And when the building itself was taken, when the stone and mortar were swallowed back into the deep, only the memory remained. A memory of a light that would not die, a memory of voices singing in the dark, a memory of men who walked into the sea because they could no longer bear to resist the call. Some say the promontory is still active, that on nights when the stars are hidden and the ocean is black, a light appears, faint at first, then growing, then blazing with the intensity of a captured star, and if you are close enough, if you are foolish enough to approach, you will hear them. The keepers, all of them, still tending the light, still keeping watch, still singing the song that was taught to them by the things that live beneath the waves. And if you listen too long, if you let the melody into your mind, you will feel it, the pull, the urge to climb down to the rocks, to walk into the cold water, to join the chorus, to become another keeper of the light that burns eternal in the place where the sea and the abyss meet and merge and become one. The Lighthouse service officially closed the Cape Mercy case file in 1895. They marked it as resolved. They moved on to other stations, other keepers, other lights. But those who served in the years after never forgot. They would sit in the keepers' quarters of their own assigned stations, safe and warm, and they would think of Cape Mercy. They would think of Samuel Crane and Joseph Ridley and Thomas Webb. They would think of the men who came after, whose names were not recorded, whose bones were never found. And they would climb the stairs to their own lantern rooms, and they would tend their own lamps, and they would look out over the water and wonder if their light was burning for the ships at sea, or for something else, something that watched from below, something that sang, something that waited. In the decades that followed, the story became a legend. Old lighthouse keepers would tell it to new recruits as a warning. Do not neglect your duties. Do not let the light fail. Do not listen to strange sounds in the night. Do not look too long into the darkness beyond your beam, because the darkness looks back, and sometimes it calls. And once you have heard that call, once it has wormed its way into your thoughts, there is no escape. You will tend the light. You will keep the watch. You will sing the song. Whether you are alive or dead, whether your body remains or is taken, you will serve forever. The last confirmed sighting of the phantom light at Cape Mercy was in 1923. A fishing trawler was working the waters near the coast when the crew spotted a glow on the horizon. They assumed it was another vessel, but as they drew closer, they realized it was coming from the shore, from the promontory where the lighthouse had once stood. The light was brilliant, white-blue, pulsing slightly like a heartbeat. The captain ordered the boat to turn away, but one of the crew, a young man named Daniel Ortiz, became fixated on it. He stood at the rail, staring. The other men tried to pull him away, but he fought them. He screamed that he could hear his name being called, that they were calling to him, that he had to go to them. It took 3 men to restrain him. They tied him to a mast and covered his eyes. The boat fled south. When they reached port, Ortiz was catatonic. He was taken to a hospital. He never spoke again. He died 6 months later. The doctor said it was a wasting disease. But those who had been on the boat knew better. They had seen his eyes. They had heard him whispering in his sleep, singing, always singing. After that, no one reported seeing the light. Perhaps it finally went out. Perhaps it moved to some other place. Or perhaps those who saw it simply chose not to speak of it. To acknowledge it would be to invite it into your life, to give it power. So the story was forgotten, buried under decades of silence. The coast moved on. The world moved on. But the promontory remains. The rocks remain. And on certain nights, if you stand in the right place at the right time, they say you can still hear it, the singing, faint and far away, like a memory of sound, like an echo from a place that no longer exists except in the space between waking and dreaming. The song of the keepers who never left, the song of the light that never died, the song of Cape Mercy. There is a final piece to this story, one that was not widely known until much later. In 1947, long after the events at Cape Mercy had faded into obscurity, a woman named Elizabeth Crane contacted a historian who specialized in Oregon maritime history. She was the granddaughter of Samuel Crane, the head keeper who had disappeared in 1893. She had found a letter among her grandmother's belongings, a letter that Samuel Crane had written but never sent. It was dated October 10th, one day before the last entry in Thomas Webb's journal. The historian agreed to meet with her. She showed him the letter. It was brief, written in Crane's neat hand, but the words were shaken, uncertain. It read, "My dearest Mary, if you receive this letter, know that I have failed in my duty, not to the service, not to the light, but to you and to God. I do not know how to explain what has happened here. I do not know if I believe it myself, but I must try. For 3 weeks now, we have heard singing at night. It comes from the rocks below the lighthouse. At first, I thought it was the wind. Then I thought it was my imagination. But Joseph heard it. Thomas heard it. We all heard it. And last night, I saw them. I climbed down to the rocks with a lantern, determined to find the source. And I found them. Pale things, neither man nor beast. They stood in the surf and sang. And when they saw me, they reached out. I should have fled. I should have run back up the path and barred the door and prayed for morning, but I did not, because the song was beautiful, Mary, more beautiful than anything I have ever heard. It promised peace. It promised an end to loneliness. It promised a purpose beyond the endless turning of the light. And I wanted it. God forgive me. I wanted it. I stood there and listened, and I felt something inside me break, or perhaps it was something inside me awakening. I do not know. I came back to the lighthouse. I have tried to resume my duties, but I hear the song even now in daylight, even when the sea is calm. It is calling me, and I know that soon I will answer. Joseph has already gone. He walked down to the water this morning. I watched him go. I did not stop him. I could not, because I understood. I understand now. The light is not ours to tend. It belongs to them. It has always belonged to them. We are not the keepers. We are the kept. And when our time comes, we will join them in the deep. We will sing with them. We will become part of the light that never fails. Do not mourn me, Mary. Do not search for me. I am already gone. I left the moment I heard the first note of their song. What remains is only an echo, a shadow waiting to be claimed. Tell our children I love them. Tell them I did my duty as long as I could. But in the end, the sea takes us all. The light takes us all. And we are grateful. Yours in eternity, Samuel. The historian made a copy of the letter and returned the original to Elizabeth Crane. She asked him what it meant. He told her he did not know. but he included the letter in a paper he published years later on the psychological effects of isolation on lighthouse keepers. He did not draw any supernatural conclusions. He chalked it up to madness, brought on by solitude and stress. But those who read the paper and knew the full story of Cape Mercy understood that Samuel Crane's letter was not the ravings of a madman. It was a confession, an explanation, a glimpse into the truth of what had happened on that promontory in the fall of 1893. The truth that some places are doorways, that some lights are not lit by human hands, that some songs are older than the world and more powerful than the will to resist them. Cape Mercy is not marked on modern maps. The promontory has no name. The lighthouse is forgotten by all but a handful of historians and those who study the stranger corners of American folklore. But the place endures. The rocks endure. And on nights when the moon is new and the tide is at its highest, the fishermen who work those waters will tell you to stay away, to give that stretch of coast a wide berth, because the light may be gone, but what called the light into being is still there, still waiting, still singing, and it will not stop until it has claimed every keeper, every light, every soul that dares to stand on that threshold between the world of men and the world below. Some frontiers were never meant to be crossed, some doors were never meant to be opened, and some lights were never meant to burn, but they burn nonetheless, and they will burn forever, tended by hands that are no longer flesh, guided by minds that are no longer human, serving a purpose that transcends understanding and extends into eternity. That is the story of the lighthouse that kept burning after everyone inside had vanished. It is not a story with a moral. It is not a story with a resolution. It is simply a story of what happens when men build their monuments in places that belong to older, darker powers, when they bring light to corners of the earth that were meant to remain hidden, when they impose order on chaos and reason on mystery. The sea does not forgive such arrogance. The deep does not forget. And the things that dwell in the spaces between the waves are patient. They have time. They have eternity. And they will wait, singing their ancient song until the next keeper arrives, until the next light is lit, until the next offering is made. And then they will rise from the depths, pale and eyeless and hungry, and they will call, and someone, somewhere, will answer. Because that is the way of the cursed frontier. That is the way of the places where the world ends and something else begins. That is the way of the lighthouse that burns eternal, tended by ghosts and fed by the souls of those who dared to answer the call of the deep. The sea keeps its secrets, the rocks keep their silence, and the light keeps burning now and forever. World without end. Amen.